This is Daniel Simon from Baton Rouge Community College. This is week 5 of my lecture series, which will be on the rise of fascism, and we'll also discuss the beginning of World War II as well. Previously, last week, we had covered pretty much World War One and also the Russian Revolution. So we had kind of talked up to like the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This week, of course, we'll be talking about between the wars, between World War One and World War Two, with the rise of all the fascist dictators in Europe. We'll talk about the rise of Mussolini, Hitler. I'll also go into like what happened to Germany after World War One, and then I will talk about how World War Two kind of progresses because of Hitler and his policies in Nazi Germany and Europe. So that's like most of the main things we'll cover today with part of week 1. And then later this week, second lecture will go also into details about some of the major events of World War II. Now, Germany after World War One declined due to the fact that, of course, the Germans lost World War One by the end of 1918. Pretty much the German armies collapsed on the Western Front against the Allies, and the Allies actually drove the Germans back into Belgium at that point. And Germany experienced a revolution, sometimes called the German Revolution, in 1918, 1919. And Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate his throne. He fled to Holland at one point. And eventually, the Germans formed a new government, which later became known as the Weimar government or Weimar Republic, just what they called Germany from around 1918 to 1933. It's actually not an official name. It's just a nickname they called the German Empire from like the 1920s to the early 1930s, due to the fact that the government of this republic that they founded, of course, 1918, 1919, was founded in Weimar, Germany. And so that's hence got the name Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic was a type of government that was based on a liberal constitution that was eventually finalized in August of 1919. And so that's why they started dubbing it the Weimar Republic. Later, of course, the capital would be moved back to Berlin in the 1920s. And this Republican government created a constitution where there were two heads of state. They had a president that was elected, like a president of Germany. And then they had a chancellor of Germany, which was the head of the government. And the president would nominate the chancellor, whoever the leader of what political party that controlled the government in, of course, the German parliament, which was at that time called the Reichstag, which it would be up to like the 1930s and 40s. Also, this constitution was pretty liberal. It gave like all men and also women the right to vote, like universal suffrage, which I think the minimum age was, I think, 20. And so men and women could actually be elected as representatives to the German parliament, the Reichstag. The leaders of this government, of course, signed the Treaty of Versailles. I think they were kind of involved in that, which the Treaty of Versailles, I told you, was finalized in June of 1919. And so some Germans thought that the Germans had been stabbed in the back because they agreed to what was in the treaty, because we already talked about how harsh the Treaty of Versailles was. And so that kind of led to the rise of the Nazis later under Hitler, because Hitler kind of viewed the Treaty of Versailles as being, too harsh, and he would use it to gain power later. It becomes a major topic in a lot of his speeches he would give. The Weimar also struggled between the wars. That was due to all the post World War One economic situation that happened in Germany. Germany went through some different depressions after the war. There was a post-World War depression that affected Germany after the war. And a lot of that had to do with just the change between war and going back to peacetime. It happened in the United States. They had a post-war depression as well that happened. And Germany went through a period where in the early 1920s, there was like massive hyperinflation where money was just worthless, like the German mark and just like the German, their version of the dollar. Yeah, it got to the point where the German money was like totally worthless. And if you wanted to buy something, you know, it took like a wheelbarrow full of money to buy like food or whatever. And so that created a lot of negative situations, a lot of unemployment at that time. And by the late 20s, it got better, in Germany, like in the United States with the Roaring Twenties and all that. But when the Great Depression hit, starting in 1929, then of course that made things worse. More unemployment. Not really that last one there. We'll get to later with the Great Depression was one of the key things that led to the rise of like the Nazis and Hitler taking power and all that. And with that, along with the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler used that to kind of gain power over time. So we'll get more into that later, about how the Nazis take power in Germany. We do need to talk about the rise of fascism in Europe, which became very popular in the 1920s. This was due to the failure of democracy after World War I and all the economic situations that were bad in Europe that made people look at that type of political ideology instead of more liberal ideas. And fascism was a type of usually kind of considered like a far right political ideology. It's definitely right of like liberalism, socialism, and communism, which is why it is. Some of it's kind of like the Nazis were kind of somewhat socialist, if you know about that. But the fascists tended to be very pro-nationalist. They wanted to revitalize the state. They wanted to revitalize the military. They were very anti-liberal, but especially anti-communist, anti-socialist, which kind of marks the difference between them, those on the left and all that. A lot of these, of course, states that, of course, adopt fascism tend to be totalitarian type states ruled by dictators, which tend to have like secret type polices, like the Italians and the Nazis had. There's like a lack of democracy, civil liberties, usually under these kind of regimes, and people tend to like spy on each other a lot. It does have some commonality with communism, like say in the Soviet Union, but the fascist states still, embraced the ideas of capitalism, even though in Germany it was more like a state-controlled capitalism. The guy that was considered, of course, the first fascist, of course, back here is Benito Mussolini. You see the Duce, they called him. Mussolini was considered to be one of the first fascist dictators of Europe. Mussolini, like a lot of these men that were, later fascists, were involved in World War One. He was like an ex-World War One veteran. I believe he was a school teacher at one point. And actually, at one point, Mussolini was originally a socialist. And if you know about that, and then after the war, he kind of switched more to being more to the right. And Mussolini, in 1919, formed a political party in Italy that was called it's called different names, but usually called the Italian Fascist Party or Fascisti Party. And it was, of course, a right-wing type political party that was anti-socialist, anti-communist. Mussolini also wanted to use his party to try and revitalize Italy as a major power, especially in the Mediterranean region. I think he tried to, if you know about it, compare modern Italy to ancient Italy with the Romans. And so one of the things that Mussolini did was he adopted a symbol, which is the fasci symbol, which is an ancient symbol of Rome, which symbolized like Roman power. Fasces like a bundle of rods. And that's actually what it usually means. It has, of course, an axe coming out of it. And the fasci symbol became the main symbol of fascism, and it's where the word fascism comes from, or the word fascist. And of course, they put it on buildings, they put it on flags, etc. That became the center of the whole movement overall. Mussolini also, after the war, formed this paramilitary force, which was mostly made up of ex-veterans of World War One. That was called the Blackshirts. They would wear these black uniforms like he's wearing. In fact, Mussolini began dressing up later, I think by the 20s, I know, wearing military-style uniforms, which a lot of these fascist dictators do. Hitler does the same thing, too. Franco kind of did it, too, in Spain. And anyway, the Blackshirts were mostly a force that was kind of like his bodyguards to protect Mussolini, but they were also used to, I guess, beat up anybody that was against his regime or against the fascists and all that. And the Blackshirts helped Mussolini gain power in 1922. At the time in Italy in the early 20s, Italy was going through a lot of conflict after the war. Of course, there had been like a post-war depression, of course, in Italy, like in Germany. And it looked like Italy was going to end up in a civil war between those that were the left versus the right. On the left, you had the socialists and communists. And then on the right, you had the fascists in the country. And anyway, what the fascists wanted to do is they wanted to put Mussolini in as prime minister of the Kingdom of Italy to kind of stabilize the country. And so the Mussolini and the Blackshirts organized this March on Rome, as it's called, the March on Rome, which took place in October of 1922, or about a week, October 22nd to 29th, these are the dates of it. It involved like 30,000 people that were pro-fascist. And Mussolini kind of participated in some of it. He didn't really do the whole march, but it evidently impressed the king of Italy to pretty much put Mussolini in as prime minister. And so in 1922, Mussolini became prime minister of Italy. Within about 2-3 years, takes him a while, I think by 1924-25, Mussolini then becomes a dictator over Italy. And he puts all of his fascists in different parts of the government and the military. And with that, he's able to kind of take control of the government. And Hitler would kind of do the same thing later. When he would come to power in Germany, he would kind of follow the same pattern, I guess, as Mussolini did, using democracy kind of to gain power and then taking over. And but Mussolini went by a title that was famous, which was the Il Duce, they called him. Yeah, the Il Duce, which meant in Italian, different translations, but usually means the Duke, and some people say the leader. And he would be in power from 1922 to, I guess, the end of the war. I know he was prime minister in 1943, but he was in control of Italy until at least the end of 1945. Later, Italy and Germany would form kind of an alliance by the 1920s and 30s, which would be the Axis powers, and really by the 1930s, so-called Axis power in 1936, and then later formed the tripartite pact too with Japan as well. And so those powers like, Germany, Italy, Japan will later be the Axis powers that fight in World War II. However, Italy was kind of a weak ally of Germany. Germany felt later like it was shackled to a corpse. It wasn't really that powerful state. But Mussolini did try to revitalize Italy, if you know about this, by becoming a kind of a colonial power. And under him, Italy took over Libya, and they also took over what is Abyssinia, which is now called Ethiopia. Both those areas would be kind of controlled by by Italy by the 1930s as well. As well. Of course, they used to make all kinds of jokes about Mussolini. They used to joke that Mussolini would make the trains run on time. You know, oh, the El Duce. He was kind of like idolized and all that. And so he had kind of his hands, in pretty much everything in controlling Italy overall. Now, Hitler was really impressed with Mussolini. In fact, Hitler, in his younger days, idolized Mussolini. There's a very famous story where Hitler sent an autographed picture of Mussolini to him to get it signed. And he gets mailed back to him. And Mussolini sent the picture back to him saying, "Who the hell are you?" Anyway, let's of course next talk about also the other fascist dictator that was very famous. That of course was Adolf Hitler. Of course, later of course in Nazi Germany, right here, probably the most famous fascist dictator really of between the wars in World War II overall. Of course, Hitler had a different background than Mussolini. Hitler, of course, was Austrian born from a place called Linz, Austria, which is in northern Austria-Hungary at the time. He was born April 20, 1889, looks like it. And Hitler came from a kind of a middle-class background. His father was actually like a customs agent for the Austro-Hungarian government. And his father died when he was very young. I think when he was like about 13. And Hitler, of course, if you know about it, never finished high school. Like he flunked out his senior year, which I think it had to do with some kind of drinking incident where he had gotten drunk or something and the school found out. They flunked him. So he never finished high school. So this made it very difficult for him to get into like a college or school or whatever. Later, if you know about it, he lived in Vienna, Austria. And he tried to get into the Vienna art school that was there, and they basically rejected it. So originally, Hitler didn't really want to become a politician or anything like that, or a customs. I think his father wanted to be a civil servant like him, like a customs agent or whatever. And he wanted to be an artist, and so it's kind of ironic that Hitler would end up being a politician, of course, later. What happened was, of course, in 1913, Hitler moved to Munich, Bavaria, which is in southern Germany, within the German Empire. And of course, World War I broke out, and he eventually joined the like a Bavarian regiment for the Kingdom of Bavaria. So that's what he fought for in the war. And he fought for I forget what, it was some kind of Bavarian regiment, but he was mostly known for being like a dispatch runner, where he would bring like messages from like headquarters to the front. He actually got wounded in battle at one point. I think he got poison gas where it blinded him at the end of the war. And he was actually given I think if you look at that picture, he was given I think he had 2 Iron Crosses. He was kind of somewhat of a war hero. But you got 2 Iron Crosses, one first class and one second class. And of course, the famous story about the first class Iron Cross he got was it was from through the help of a Jewish officer that actually got it for him, which is kind of ironic. So that's kind of weird about that. Now, after the war, Hitler then joined this political party in Munich, Germany, that was called the German Workers' Party. It was some kind of working class political party that was there to kind of help workers out. I think it was founded by some kind of what was the guy's original founder? His name was Anton Drexler. He was a Munich locksmith. He founded it. He joined it in September of 1919. He took this political party, and within like 2 years, he became one of the main leaders of it. And the reason why was because Hitler was a great speaker. A lot of the meetings that they would, I think, hold like the Nazi Party later, as it's called, will be held like in mostly beer halls, like a bar, basically. So everybody'd sit around drinking beer and they'd listen to Hitler give speeches. He had a real good gift of the gab. That's why Hitler, became so famous. A lot of the speeches were usually against like the Treaty of Versailles, which was real popular, and of course, also, ran it against like communists and Jews, and that's the kind of stuff that the Nazis will be big behind. And over time, he took this party, and by 1921, he remolded it into what became known as the Nazi Party, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which is the full name, also called the NSDAP. Of course, it was later known as the Nazi Party for short, which is what the enemies called it. And anyway, the National Socialists, they were basically like fascists, but they were more like right-wing fascists that were very pro-German, and they kind of saw the German people and German race as like superior. They call the Germans the Aryan race and all that. They saw other peoples like Jews and Slavs as being inferior. So they were kind of like fascists, but they were more racist. Because like the Italian fascists weren't really racist, not like the Germans were. Like I think Mussolini had a Jewish mistress or something like that. You read about it, so they're basically big against the Jews and the communists, pretty much. Hitler also adopted pretty much their symbols, like like you read the swastika, the Hakenkreuz, which is the hook cross, that became the symbol, of course, of the Nazi Party, which they think Hitler developed. Which I think the theory about how the swastika came about was that it was Hitler saw it in a church, so they think he was originally Catholic and all that. But I think that's the theory about where it came from, although they do believe that the swastika, is an Eastern symbol that goes back to like India, ancient India. And it was later perverted by the Nazis, and of course the symbol is different, and the fact that usually the Nazi symbol is usually more at an angle. It's not straight, so it's kind of usually at a kind of a diagonal angle. They used other symbols like iron crosses, the eagle, which kind of like a Roman symbol, that kind of thing was also used too, by the Nazis as well. The Nazis would take a long time to gain power, like from the 1920s to the 30s over time. Hitler, of course, would be known later, at least by the early 30s. They called him the Führer, which means the leader. And so people would address him as that. Like, it's kind of funny, but you would call somebody up, you would say, "Heil Hitler," or something like that. Crazy stuff like that. But even though he's not there, But like on the phone, with somebody, "Heil Hitler, bye," But I'll go also into like some of the major leaders of Hitler that were very famous, that were under him. And of course, the two biggest guys that were under Hitler were Heinrich Himmler and, of course, Hermann Goering. Heinrich Himmler, of course, it's kind of a debate about which one was the more powerful one under Hitler. I guess some people think Himmler was 2 and maybe Goering was 3. But those two definitely the two biggest leaders that were under Hitler, especially about the 30s and the 40s. Himmler was the head of different things. He was head of what they call the Gestapo, which is what the German secret police was. It's kind of like the German Nazi version of the KGB, basically. That's what it is. And then they also had the SS, also called the Schutzstaffel, which the so-called Blackshirts, which SS, I think it stood for different things, but most of the Schutzstaffel was kind of like a security secret police force too. They had as well, which was like more like an internal police of Nazi Germany that was there. They were famous for their black uniforms, and they would also wear these hats you can see with the death's head symbol on it. You have like a skull and crossbones on the top of the hat. And I think they also sometimes would have labels that would, like, maybe on the collars or whatever, You can't see it here, but sometimes on the collars they would have the SS symbol, which would look like lightning bolts. And the SS were instrumental in being behind like the Holocaust. Like they're the ones that rounded up a lot of the Jews in Europe. They ran the death camps. They also ran a lot of these. You've heard of the Einsatzgruppen, you may have heard of. That was in the beginning of World War II. They would go out and they'd round up Jews and communists and others and just shoot them, basically. So they're the ones that were mostly behind the whole final solution, the SS, later on. Hermann Goering was also famous too. Hermann Goering was actually a World War I ace. Actually, I think I'd flown with the Red Baron during World War One, and he was kind of one of the most prestigious ones that really joined the Nazi Party overall. Goering, and Goering was later famous for different things. He was head of the German Luftwaffe, which is what they call the German Air Force in the 30s and 40s. So he helped develop it. So the German Air Force was pretty good. He had one of the best air forces in the world in the 30s. And Goering was ahead of like the other stuff too. Like Goering is the one that helped develop the German concentration camps in Germany, which is why he got in trouble. Like Dachau, and other concentration camps later. I think he was head of the Prussian police force as well, and kind of ran Prussia, which was still kind of a state that was under Nazi Germany. So both those guys were pretty big under Hitler, or Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Goering. Ones I don't have in there, which I'll mention too, that were famous. They had another guy named Ernest Röhm, R-O-H-M, and Röhm was the head of what they call the SA. The SA was this, they call it sometimes the Storm Division, but they usually call it the Brown Shirts because they were famous for their brown uniforms. And the Brown Shirts were like originally the bodyguards of Hitler, and they were used kind of like they were kind of similar to like Mussolini's Black Shirts, and they would kind of, protect Hitler at rallies. They would go out and beat up anybody that was against his movement. Like anybody who was a Jew or a communist, socialist, they would beat them up. And they were kind of like these paramilitary force that was a bunch of thugs, which a lot of them were. So that's what the SA was, or the Brown Shirts, which I think the name Sturmabteilung means storm detachment, is sometimes what it means. They also had the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, which was like the SS security service. It was like the police of the police of the SS. It's kind of weird. That was like this internal police force of the SS they had. And it was mostly led in the 30s and early 40s by Reinhard Heydrich. You may have heard of him. He was a big Nazi guy, Reinhard Heydrich. And under Heydrich, they think he's the one that helped. Have you ever heard of Adolf Eichmann? He was like right under him. Adolf Eichmann was the guy that rounded up all the Jews in Europe. And he was involved, Adolf Eichmann was involved in the SD as well with Reinhard Heydrich. And Heydrich had a lot of people killed, and he loved to have people hanged. And so people called Reinhard Heydrich sometimes Hangman Heydrich. So other guys that are not in there, I don't know if you heard of Rudolf Hess. He was big under Hitler. He was like Hitler's personal secretary. You'll see a lot of pictures of him with Hitler, like from the 1920s and 30s. And Rudolf Hess was the guy that helped write Hitler's book Mein Kampf. He basically, Hitler dictated it to him and he helped write it. Another guy, I think I was going to, Joseph Goebbels, kind of a funny guy. But Joseph Goebbels was Hitler's top head of like propaganda. He was head of like the Ministry of Information that dealt with like the newspapers and radio and TV and movies. And he used a lot of propaganda under Hitler in his rise to power, but especially under the Nazi regime later on. So it's a lot of weird people under Hitler, people that probably wouldn't have normally gotten into power overall. A lot of these guys were later thugs. They kind of ran the Nazi regime that were under Hitler. I think maybe Hermann Goering may have been the only one that was actually kind of, he came from a decent background because I think he was somewhat from upper class. It was also, big World War I ace under, the Red Baron. Of course, there's a lot of great generals that were under Hitler we'll talk about later. Rommel, Manstein, etc. A lot of them came from nobility originally. A lot of these guys go back to World War One though. We'll talk later about Hitler, like some of those other guys later. Now, Hitler, of course, would try to seize power in the 1920s. And of course, they had the famous beer hall push that happened in March of November of 1923. Hitler kind of had seen how Mussolini had tried to seize power. So in November of 1923, he tried this coup in Munich, Bavaria, to try to overthrow the government. And so he and the Nazis marched on the government. Hitler was backed by this German general named Erich von Ludendorff, you may have heard of, who we talked about before, who was one of the best German generals of the war with Hindenburg. And anyway, what happened was they tried to seize the government buildings, but the Munich police came out and they put it down. They stopped it. And it happened on November 8th to the 9th, 1923. And it was called the Beer Hall Push because it started in a beer hall. I think it was the Hofbrauer House, which is in Munich, Germany, which is kind of famous still there, the actual beer hall, the Hofbrauer House. And anyway, Hitler got arrested. About 16 Nazis, I think, got killed in the attempted coup. And Hitler was sentenced to several months in prison for treason. He was supposed to be given like 5 years, but he was only served about 9 months. And of course, when he was in prison, Hitler eventually wrote his famous book called Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf, which means my struggle or my battle in German, became kind of like Hitler's political testament and autobiography about his early life and rise to power. And it was published around, I think, 1925, I think it is. And anyway, this particular book was important because it kind of outlined what Hitler was going to do when he was going to seize power. And very few people read it outside of Germany. I think if people had read that more, they would have realized how bad Hitler really was. Hitler talked about all kinds of things in the book. He talked about how, the Germans were the master race and people like the communists and the Jews need to be exterminated. He talked about taking over Eastern Europe, which he would. He talked about annexing Austria into Germany, which he called Anschluss, which it was, of course, happened later, of course, around 1938. So all things that Hitler talks about, in Mein Kampf pretty much come true later on. And of course, he used Mein Kampf, like the money he got from it, the royalties or whatever, to kind of campaign and, and continue his bid to expand Nazi power in Germany. And he kind of survived on it, like the money from it. Now, the Nazis struggled, though. He's talking about the Nazis like late 1920s. They struggled to try to gain power. So Hitler, part of why Hitler became more popular than the Nazis had more to do with economic things that happened by the late 20s. Of course, in 1929, you had the stock market crash. In October of 1929 occurred in the United States. And that caused the Great Depression to follow, which spread from the United States to other parts of the world. So Europe, probably by 1930, was affected by the Great Depression. And so because of that, that enabled the Nazis to become more popular because in Germany, a lot of people, were unemployed. I think by 1932, there was like 6 million people unemployed, kind of like now, what happened with the virus, caused all the people to become unemployed. Well, the same thing happened in Germany. And so people started to listen to the Nazis, listen to the Germans about what Hitler had to say. And one of the things that Hitler did to spread his message about the Nazis was he was one of the first politicians to use the airplane, which the airplane had been popularized in Europe by Charles Lindbergh when he had flown like in the 1920s across the Atlantic. And so the countries in Europe like France, Britain, Germany, and all that, started to look more into using the airplane even more. not just for military reasons. And so Hitler realized he could use the airplane to fly all over Germany, and spread his ideas. So that helped popularize the Nazis, overall. And so in 1932, when the German presidential election was held, he ran for president of Germany. Now, there had been different presidents of Germany before this. The first president of Germany, and I guess they had elected around 1919, had been Frederick Ebert. And he had served 2 terms. And then the second president that ran later was President von Hindenburg. He was, I think, had been elected around 1925, I think it is. And anyway, he basically was running for a second term. I think that's right. Well, it was 25, I think. I don't know if that's the correct date or not, but I'll have to check on that. But anyway, he was running for a second term. And I think Hindenburg had wanted to retire. He was getting pretty much kind of too old at that point. I think he would die within like 2 years later. So a lot of people didn't want the Nazis to gain power. And so what happened was Hitler ran against Hindenburg. He ran a pretty good campaign, but Hindenburg was just too popular because he was a household name. They had Zeppelins named after him, like the Hindenburg. And anyway, Hitler came in second, of course, lost the race. However, it did help the Nazis in national elections, like representatives to the Reichstag. And so basically what happened was because of, the Nazis doing so well in national elections, it eventually indirectly will get Hitler into power. So instead of becoming president, what's going to happen? He's going to end up being chancellor instead. So by 1933, the Nazis end up with like a majority in the Reichstag as the political party. Because of that, it forces Hindenburg to create a new government with basically Hitler as chancellor. I think the Nazis only controlled like 37% of the vote, but it allowed them to create a new government, which the Nazis were kind of a share of it with it. And so January the 30th, 1933, Hitler becomes basically Chancellor of Germany. And they think that's sometimes seen as the date of when Nazi Germany kind of starts, or what they call the Third Reich, which Nazi Germany will last from 1933 to 1945. However, it takes a while for the Nazis to take total power. It'll be about maybe a year before that happens, between 1933 and 1934. Of course, one of the first things that happens after Hitler comes in is that in February of 1933, there's a fire that happens called the Reichstag Fire. The Reichstag, which was the German parliamentary building, actually burned down. And they don't think it was an accident. They do believe it was actually set on fire on purpose. Of course, there's a debate about who was behind it, of course, now. But of course, the Nazis accused this anarchists and communists that burned it down. Although I think they proved later that maybe the Nazis themselves burned it down. There's been a big debate about that, about what happened. So some people think it was kind of like this black flag. You know what a black flag is? Type incident where they basically the state attacks itself. So they think maybe that's what happened. That maybe the Nazis basically made it look like somebody else did it, but they did it themselves. So I think some people accused the Nazis of doing that. So what happened was then the Nazis then helped pass this act through the Reichstag building. I think the Reichstag government, which I think the parliament met in like a opera house, which is kind of funny. And the Enabling Act was this German act that basically what it did was it did 2 things. It gave Hitler totalitarian powers, which was supposed to be temporary for like 5 years. because there was a fear that the communists were trying to take over, because they had tried already in 1919 to take over Germany. And and then the other thing it did was it banned all non-Nazi political parties. So what that did was it made Germany a one-party state as the Nazi party. That was the only party that you could be in, that could run the government. And so with that, Hitler was able to basically put all the Nazis in the government, and he took over the state. So it's kind of like what Mussolini did in Italy. Same thing. So within a year, he was able to do this. Like by 1934, he just takes over the government, and Nazi Germany becomes a totalitarian state, like I said. What happened to all the people that were in other political parties? Well, they were arrested, if you know about this. And Hermann Goering, when Hitler took over, started building like these concentration camps all over Germany. Anybody who was against the regime, they threw them in there, and people were in prison. Some people were probably shot or killed, pretty much. And so that was the beginning of, also some Jews, starting to be rounded up too, which they will later, especially after Kristallnacht. Then Hitler purged the political party of any kind of Nazis that were against him, especially Nazis that were kind of more liberal. Like Ernest Röhm was arrested. He was killed, shot by Hitler. This was called different names. Some people call it the Nazi blood purge, which happened in late June of 1934. Actually June 30th to July 2nd, 1934 is usually the dates of it. Happened over a period of around 3 days or so. Some people call it the Night of the Long Knives. It's kind of a nickname. They call it that because of some kind of commemorative daggers that were given to people that were kind of involved in it. And Himmler and Goering were the two main Nazi leaders that were involved in the Nazi purge. And so it helped to solidify Hitler's power. And Ernest Röhm, who had been the head of the SA, was really the closest threat to really stopping the rise of Hitler. Because after he was killed, pretty much, Hitler just took over. And then what happened to Paul von Hindenburg, who was been the president, of course, still at this point, he basically died in 1934, pretty much of old age. They didn't kill him off, the Nazis. And so with Hindenburg dead, what the Nazis and Hitler decided to do was they took the chancellor position of Germany and the German presidency, they merged together as one. And so after that, Hitler was called the Führer. So he's basically this head of state now, the leader. And they actually had a plebiscite over it, about this, a referendum in 1934 to elect him. And of course, the majority elected Hitler, to be, the Führer of Germany, which he'll hold that position until, pretty much April 1945. April 30th, 1945, I think is when he killed himself. So anyway, that's how Hitler seized power and all that. Now, let's also talk for a few minutes on how Hitler defied the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, in the 1930s, Hitler tries to revitalize Germany, and of course, Hitler tried to, make Germany this great power. Like he showcased the, I think it was the 1936 Olympics in Germany. He tried to, to show the Germans as the master race and all of that. And anyway, the West was weak. And that's part of why the Nazis were able to do what they did. Hitler came to power. He began rearming Germany. He reinstituted the draft in Germany. So all the men had to be drafted into the armies, the so-called German Wehrmacht. And the powers like France, Britain, they really kind of sat around and just watched Hitler gain more power. They didn't really want to fight Hitler and the Nazi Germany. They had fought, World War I. Several million of their men had been killed in the war. So they weren't really ready for another world war at that point. And so what the West did, like Britain, France, etc., they tried to use diplomacy to try to stop the Nazis. One way they did it later, as we'll see, was that they tried to use the policy of appeasement, thinking that that was one way to basically stop Hitler. And of course, it proved to be one of the main reasons why World War II broke out, because of not trying to stop Hitler, especially in the early stages of his rise. Then the League of Nations, which we had talked about at the end of World War I, it was pretty weak. It really couldn't. I think it would put embargoes maybe on states or whatever, but it really didn't do anything to stop the rise of like fascist Germany, fascist Italy, or fascist Japan, and all that. So none of that really, helped, overall. And then of course Hitler, about it, starting in the mid-30s, late 30s, began reclaiming territory that Germany had lost after World War One. Of course, one of the first things that the Germans did, if you know about it, was in 1936. They marched into the Rhineland and took the Rhineland over, which is in the western part of Germany, on the border with France. And of course, the Allies kind of stared at them and didn't do anything about it. Then, of course, the Germans then made an alliance with Italy, the so-called Rome-Berlin Axis of 1936. This was where it was a case where Germany and Italy formed an alliance together, which later became a military alliance that became known as the Axis powers. It would also later include Japan, 1940, which was later called, I told you before, the Tripartite Pact. The Tripartite Pact, as it was called. So Germany, Italy, Japan, those are the three main alliances that the Allies later fight in World War II. And so we'll talk more into that later when we get more into World War II. Also, another thing that Italy and Germany did in the 30s was they both supported Francisco Franco, which took over Spain, starting in the late 1930s. The Spanish Civil War was a famous war that took place between 1936 to 1939. And this war was a war where you had like a liberal government that got overthrown by basically the Spanish military in a coup d'etat. And it led to a civil war. And Spain divided into two sides. You had those that were the Republican forces that were more to the left. And then you had the Spanish military that was more to the right. And of course, the Francisco Franco was one of the top generals in the Spanish military. He basically got involved in the war against the leftist government. And he was backed by the Germans and the Italians, who were, pro-right-wing governments, basically. Of course, there's debate about whether Franco was really a fascist. Some people kind of claim he was, but really wasn't. But a lot of people think he was. And then the Soviet side backed the Republican side. They sent forces and supplies to try to help them out too as well. This civil war would last 3 years, from 1936 to 39. And the Spanish Civil War was very important because it kind of showcased the future militaries that would fight in World War II. Especially, I know the air forces, I think of like the Germans and the Italians and all that in the war. And so it was kind of like a precursor to, they say, World War II. Of course, what happened in the war was that Franco seized power in Spain, and he would control Spain until 1975. Now, Spain was, of course, neutral in the war. They didn't really fight in the war. And also what happened in 1930s, late 30s, was Germany then took over what is Austria as well, what they call Anschluss. Anschluss has different translations. Some people think it means annexation or the rejoining of Austria with Germany. And Anschluss was an idea of Hitler since going back to like when he was young. And he had talked about this in Mein Kampf. In fact, it was one of the first things that Hitler wanted to do was to join Austria, with Germany. It was like his dream. And so by the late 30s, what happened was the Nazis tried to take over Austria internally, which failed. And so I think it was like March of 1938, looks like it, the Germans threatened to take over Austria if they didn't let them enter the country. And so what happened was the Austrians basically let them in. They marched in there and took it over. And so Austria then had a referendum, and they all voted to basically merge Austria with Germany. And so Austria became part of the Greater German Reich, as they sometimes call it later, or Greater Germany. And Austria will remain part of Germany till like 1945, till the end of World War II. So everybody else kind of just, like the West, kind of stared at it and didn't do anything at that point as Austria became part of Germany. And then, of course, the other big thing that happened too, which I'll talk about, one of the last things I guess I'll talk about, is the Munich Conference. The Munich Conference, which happened in late September 1938, was a major incident prior to World War II that pretty much will lead to World War II later. And what happened was in late the fall of, I think if you go up here, this map I've got, the fall of 1930, Hitler threatened to basically take over Czechoslovakia, especially the western half, which the Nazis called it Sudetenland, because there was a bunch of Germans that were living in that area, like several million, like I want to say 3 million or more. And Czechoslovakia had been created as a state through the Treaty of Versailles. And so at this point, he was threatening war. And so there was a fear that World War II was going to break out in 1938. And so they had this conference that took place in Munich, Germany, which is called all kinds of names: the Munich Conference, the Munich Pact, the Munich Agreement. And Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met there to agree on what to do with Czechoslovakia at this point. The leaders of the different states that were there were Britain had, of course, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. France had Prime Minister Edouard Dallier. Hitler was there himself for Germany. And then Benito Mussolini was also there for Italy. And what happened was Neville Chamberlain decided that he would intervene, and he kind of made an agreement with the French to basically give in to Hitler's demands and give basically Western Czechoslovakia to Hitler, and of course in return for not going to war with the Germans. And so this was kind of considered like a form of appeasement that the West used. And a lot of people kind of view that as part of why World War II happened, because a lot of the Western powers like Britain thought that was the best way to avoid war, which was to use diplomacy. And it proved to be the worst way to deal with the Nazis, who were very militaristic. And so they really needed to use force to stop Hitler, but they didn't want to do it because they feared another World War I. Like before, all these men getting killed, And so Chamberlain thought that, Hitler would be a man of his word, and that would be the last thing he would seize. In fact, there's an incident where Chamberlain actually gave him this piece of paper to sign, saying he wouldn't take any more land except Western Czechoslovakia. And so Chamberlain went back to Britain. And when he got there, he made this speech about, the Munich Agreement with Hitler. And he held up this piece of paper and he said, "I believe it is peace for our time." Was his famous quote. And of course, this proved to be totally wrong about, Hitler. And they find out later that Hitler's not a man of his word. Of course, what happened afterwards was that in the spring, I think, of 1939, the Nazis then drove into the eastern part of Czechoslovakia. They seized that too. They took over that as well. And so they realized now that they can't trust Hitler. And so what's going to happen later, of course, is that the Nazis are going to also plan to take over Poland and invade that as well. And that's going to lead to World War II. And so I'm going to end my podcast because it was kind of long right here. But basically at this point, with part two coming up later. We're going to talk about how World War II breaks out. We'll talk about a lot of the major events of World War II that's going to occur. So that's it for this podcast with part one.